everyone and welcome back to my channel Beth Chats Books. Now today's video is going to be my March wrap-up video. Now March was a very good reading month for me. I managed to read all of the books that I put on my March TBR plus one other book. The other book was an audiobook, so I listened to it, I didn't read it, but it means I exceeded my March TBR, so here's a little pat on the back for me. I'm very happy with myself. Now let's just get on to the books that I read. So, the first book I read in the month of March was Homegoing by Ya Nassi. This was a really interesting read. I gave this book 4.5 out of 5 stars. I really enjoyed this story. So it follows two sisters who don't know that the other sister exists, and then we slowly go through the timeline of both of the sisters' lives and of the lives of the generations after them and their descendants. So we travel through Africa and then we travel to America in the south and also the north of America and see about plantations, slavery, a little bit of the Civil War, how everything kind of progresses for the identity of these two sisters and the generations that follow. So it's a really fascinating look at that. Each chapter is dissected into a new individual, so it kind of goes through these parallel timelines, but we dot from one character at one timeline to another character on the other timeline. So they're cut into chapters, but each new character in their chapter sometimes harks back to previous generations. So in a way, you get to know these characters very well, even though there's only one chapter dedicated specifically to a character. I thought the structure was very well done. Ya Nassi does it effortlessly. I've seen a couple of instances where authors have tried to do similar structure plots of going through generations, and previously when I've read books like that I've lost interest in the characters, but she's a phenomenal story writer because with each new character, and there is a lot of characters to go through in this book, and their new focus point, I was worried I would start to find this a bit repetitive, a bit tedious, but I was invested in the fresh new character every single time, which is real talent as a story writer, to make me invested in the character at the individual level, but also really interested in the wider narrative and the wider kind of family tree. I didn't give it a full 5 stars just because the structure as a whole I personally think is quite limited. This is the best I've ever seen the structure be done before, but personally I think the style as a whole is fairly limited. The story doesn't weave as organically as you would like, but I think this was fantastic. If you're interested in anything about race and culture, then this book would definitely be for you. I really enjoyed it. It was fascinating, the characters were really interesting, and I would recommend this to everyone. I got recommended this book by Jasmine over at Dane Reads. I'll link down below her favourite books of 2017 in which she mentioned this book, because she can probably do a better job of articulating how beautiful this book is than I could. But that was my first read of the month, so there we are. The next book I read in the month of March was The Beginning of the World in the Middle of the Night by Jen Campbell. Now this is a short story collection that deals with the theme of magical realism. So the stories are very mixed. The first story deals with an individual who buys animal hearts off the internet with the goal to try and keep putting the animals' hearts into his girlfriend and hoping that she will stick around and stay in love with him, and he's been quite experimental with different animal hearts and had very different responses. So the last one he buys is a swan's heart, and that's where the story starts. There's one about mermaids, fish tanks, and kind of an aquarium vibe to that kind of story. I really enjoyed this book. This book let me know that, one, I think in the future I'm really going to enjoy short story collections and I really like that style. Two, that I really did enjoy magical realism, and I've been a bit hesitant in the past few months to say whether I like it or not because I hadn't read enough of it to know. But this is definitely very heavy magical realism and I really enjoyed it. I ended up reading this book in one sitting, so it's very easy to get through. I think I also gave this book 4.5 out of 5 stars. I didn't give it the full 5 stars because a couple of the stories were fairly vague and some of them I just didn't enjoy overall. I liked the idea, but just somehow I didn't vibe with a couple of the stories, so I couldn't give it the full 5 stars. But the fact that I read it in one sitting, that I was drawn into the characters, that I really loved the first story in particular. I was really impressed with Jen Campbell's writing, and I'm definitely going to make an effort to read anything else that she does produce in the form of short stories or novels, as I'm particularly more interested in her writing style in fiction rather than her non-fiction work. So there's that one. The next book that I read in March I don't have to hand because I lent it to my sister's friend because my sister and her friend were going away to Tunisia over the Easter period. So I kindly lent it to her because she really wanted to read it. and that is George Orwell's 1984, so I'll just put a picture up here. Now, I really wanted to love that book because I'd heard so many people say so many great things about it. It is the ultimate dystopian book, and I did thoroughly enjoy it. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars, and the reason I didn't give it higher, which I was a bit disappointed about overall, is that I think the latter half of the book gets very tedious. So there becomes a part when he's imprisoned and he's tortured, and that bit gets really tediously drawn out in my opinion. I really liked that there was a kind of romance plot. A lot of dystopians I've read don't bother with the romance element, and although you can't really call it a romance, it is a very interesting dynamic between the two. But after he comes out and the bit where Winston sees her again, up until the end, I just really was not vibing with that bit of the book at all. I just thought that that could have been snipped out. It didn't really need to be dealt with. I did a bit of research after the book and I found that he was quite poorly when 1984 was made, so I'm not aware whether he fully intended it to be as it was or whether people rushed to edit it for him, so I'm not entirely sure whether this was the loyal ending that he wanted. At the beginning of my edition of 1984 it talks about an alternative ending. So I really did enjoy it. I loved the world that it created. I loved the character of Winston and I was really invested. I just think the ending was a little bit too drawn out and a little bit tedious. We didn't really get anything out of it. The rest of it I really did enjoy, so that's why I gave it 4 out of 5 stars, but I couldn't really give it any higher unfortunately. And then the next book that I read in March was the audiobook, and that was Bill Bryson's Shakespeare. I ended up giving this 3 out of 5 stars. I managed to get through it quite fast because it was on an audiobook, but it was a non-fiction biography piece and it tended to be a little bit tedious at points. Shakespeare is a very difficult person to construct a biography of because we don't know very much about him, and Bill Bryson makes that very explicit and evident at the very beginning of this book. But then the rest of the book kind of gets shaped with a lot of speculation, but also there wasn't a lot of concrete evidence or anywhere to go for him to fill the book. So a lot of the book was filled with kind of context and then just mass speculation of where he was at these years that we don't know, what we could interpret from his relationship with very limited information, what we can assume he looked like with the only 3 images of him that we have, that we've created all the other images out of. So it was fascinating and I really enjoyed it, but it became quite a tedious read because you really couldn't glean anything out of it. And going into the biography, I didn't realise we had such limited resources on Shakespeare, so I was expecting quite a full biography in which I could learn more about him, which isn't the case. And I wouldn't recommend, if you are wanting to know more about Shakespeare, to go into it with the belief that you will. Basically the gist is I couldn't find out what I wanted to find out, which I think made the book a more frustrating read. It was interesting in parts, but when you're commuting on trains or buses and there's a lot of extensive history of the Elizabethan period and a lot of documentation and a lot of heavy factual information coming in your ear when you're not in the mood to concentrate fully on it, made it quite a tedious read. So I would like to read more Bill Bryson. I think he's a fantastic writer, and maybe this wasn't his best work and this isn't the best place to start with Bill Bryson, so I'm hoping I can read some more of his works in the future, but I wasn't blown away by this particular biography, and that's why it only gets a 3 out of 5 stars for me. And then the next book that I read in the month of March was Angie Thomas's The Hate You Give. I love this book. Now, I have a real problem at the moment with trying to put star ratings on books. So already I've gone back to Days Without End by Sebastian Barry, which was in another video, which I'll just put a card up here so you can go and check that out if you want to know any more about what I thought about that. I think I originally gave that a 4.8, and now I've fully decided to give it 5 stars because I constantly think about it all the time. So I think the gist is to take my star ratings with a pinch of salt because they might change within months. But I think I ended up giving this a 4.5 out of 5 stars. I really enjoyed this book. I'm always a bit tentative, especially with the genre of YA, which is so loved on BookTube, to buy into the hype in case I don't have the same response. But this one I really did enjoy. Now, this follows Star, who lives in a deprived black African American area, who then goes to a posh white school that's a few miles drive away, a bit of a commute away, and she witnesses the death of her friend Khalil, and it goes through how she tries to cover up the secret and then she wants to find justice for him. It's a really interesting book. I particularly liked Star's parents in this. I think they had very honest, responses. I think this is very contemporary, very relevant. I think this is very true to how life is for young Black Americans living in contemporary America. So it's a really interesting story. It's hard hitting. She's addressing a population of new and upcoming teenage African Americans and teaching them the heartwarming, the heart-rending story behind this of to be true to yourself and to keep to your identity and to not lose faith. So it's a very heartwarming story that's addressed at the right people at the right time. So I was very, very impressed with it overall, and I would recommend this to anyone. Whether you're a YA fan or not, you will get so much out of this, because I certainly did. And then the last book that I read in the month of March was my only 5-star read this month, and that was Perfume by Patrick Suskind. Now this was phenomenal. I was really worried because it looks quite chunky, and when you look inside the font is quite small, so when I first started to read this I thought, oh no, it's going to be a bit of a trudge of a read. But I read this within 2 sittings. I read about 75% of it in 1 sitting, which was really, really good for me, because usually a book like this will take me a week at the moment because of work. But I was so drawn into this story. This story is so visceral about descriptions of scent. You really feel it. You can almost smell the senses. It's so descriptive. I feel like the whole narrative is framed through the sense of smell, which I think is amazing. I also loved how dark this book was. Suskind's writing made you so uncomfortable at the same time as making you morbidly fascinated with where the plot is going to go. So I felt disturbed. His attitude was unnerving. The way that it progresses was fascinating. And then I know a lot of people kind of lose a bit of respect for this book at the end because it kind of goes off into a bit of a tangent of, it kind of uses scent and sexuality, and it kind of goes on a bit of a crazy ride. Anybody who's read it will know it goes on a bit of a crazy ride at the end. But I loved the book so much that I didn't mind that. It made me think of so many other books. It's like a weaving of all these other books, but yet remaining an original piece, and that's what I found fascinating about it. So I found so many elements of Lolita in here, of Frankenstein. I think it would be fascinating to do a comparison piece, an essay on these two kind of books and the parallels, because there were so many and it was fascinating. Just adored this book. It was very creepy, it was strange and dark, it was just fantastic. So I don't know whether to do a book review of this on its own. I haven't been doing book reviews very often at the moment because with a wrap up I always feel like I say what I want to say and I don't really need to do an in-depth book review. But if you'd like one of this, then I can definitely do one for you. So that's all the books that I managed to read in March, which doesn't seem like a lot, but I was very happy with that. I'll be bringing out my April TBR very soon, so please hit the subscribe button if you want to be alerted for when those future videos are going to come out. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you very soon.